So in ACT, what we're trying to do is increase psychological flexibility. And what that means is the ability to focus on the present, let go of needless struggle with thoughts and feelings, and persist in or change behavior according to what the situation affords. So basically to show up to the hard stuff and do what matters in your life. And so I'm going to introduce you to a little behavioral term here. When you think about psychological flexibility, I want you to think about repertoires of responding. Like, how do people respond? And think about words like flexible and variable. So like, I can do a lot of things and I can move to one and to the other with a little bit of fluidity, versus inflexible, rigid, or narrow. So it's like, how many tools do you have in your toolbox? How many possibilities do you have when things are hard? So you'll hear me refer to flexibility, variability throughout this course. Basically, what psychological flexibility means is responding in a variety of ways in the face of an aversive stimulus, whether internal or external. So an aversive stimulus is just another behavioral term, and it's something that we try to get away from that is hard for us in some way. And so we want to respond with variability and flexibility to the stuff outside of us, like hard situations, and the stuff inside of us, like the emotions that show up in response to hard situations. Let's go back to this exposure example from earlier. So let's say you were afraid of a snake. Well, we'd work on helping you get closer to snakes. I actually asked this question to a lot of my clients, and this is something you can do too. It's a little verbal way of getting people on board with what we're trying to do in ACT. I'll say, hey, if you were afraid of a snake, what do you think the treatment would be? And 9 out of 10 people say something like, you'd have to, like, I don't know, hold a snake, or no, maybe you would first like look at a picture of a snake and then like go into the room with the snake and then eventually touch the snake. And then like 1 out of 10 people are like, run away? And that's probably diagnostic too. We've got our work cut out for us. I say, yeah. And so in this treatment, what we're trying to do is go towards those things that we try to get away from. And I'm going to teach you a bunch of skills for doing that. For you as the ACT practitioner, one way to think about it is, in ACT, we bring the snake into the room. So we're not just talking about pain, we're hoping the pain shows up in the conversation so we can practice responding in a new way to it. One of my clients said, you know what your therapy's like, Matt? It's like, oh my God, that's awful. Let's go there. And I think that's a little bit what it's like, but it's going towards the awful in a way that is different from what we typically do. How do we do this? What's our method? Well, let's start with a model that will help guide our interventions. So if you are getting a new therapy out in the world, it's helpful to have like an icon or a diagram for that people associate with you, and we've got one in ACT. We call it the Hexaflex. It used to be called the ACT hexagon, but then people started jokingly referring to it as the ACT Hexaflex in the ACT community, and then it just became the ACT Hexaflex. And what these are 6 processes of change: acceptance, diffusion, present moment awareness, self as context, values, and committed action. Or said in another way, making space for pain, noticing your mind, focusing on the moment, being more than your thoughts and feelings, choosing what matters, and taking meaningful action. So when I say they are processes of change, I'm encouraging you not to think of these as things, right? In the behavioral tradition from which ACT comes, we focus on things that we can see, touch, feel, and measure. So it's different from other traditions, like, let's say, traditional psychoanalysis, like ideas like the id, the ego, and the superego. Those are what we call hypothetical constructs, like imagine things inside of you that are generating your thoughts, feelings, and behavior. If we can't look at it, either I'm watching it in your behavior or you're watching it in yourself, like noticing anxiety arise, then it's not something we're going to interact with in the ACT world. And you'll notice my little catchphrases all involve ing words, and that's purposeful because these are patterns of ongoing behavior that we're going to help clients engage in either in our sessions or like first in our sessions and then out in the world so they can make change in their life. So you can think of these as 6 components or 6 processes that make up psychological flexibility. And usually when you see this hexagon, you'll see a lot of lines where each one is connected to all the others. And that's by design. So it's really easy to look at this and go, oh my God, I need to learn 6 things. But really it's one thing. It's this versus this in your actions, out in the world and towards your thoughts and feelings. And these are just, you could think of them as like 6 facets of a diamond. They're just doors through which we can get at this psychological flexibility. And what you'll notice is, as you learn, is that they all overlap with each other a lot. They're really not distinct things. So for example, if you're going to notice your mind and notice what it's doing, the thoughts and feelings it's giving to you, you think of the top point on the Hexaflex. Like, you have to focus on the moment, right? And those things inevitably will take you towards a place where you're making a little bit more space for pain, right? And as we noticed earlier, if you move towards values, if you choose what matters and take meaningful action, that pain's going to come with you. And so being open to that pain might be necessary. We also have a hexagon for the 6 processes of inflexibility, and it's never, at least that I can tell, had like a catchy name. So some people call it like the 6 processes of inflexibility or the Inflexa Hex. I'm going to see if I can call it the Inflexa Hex in this course. And it looks like this. We're trying to address these components. Experiential avoidance, which means controlling or avoiding pain in ways that get in the way of your life. Fusion, letting your mind be in charge exclusively over all other sources of information, like what you're feeling in the present or your values. Inflexible attention, which means rigidly focusing on the past or future in a way that gets in the way of living in the present and leaves you without like a deep felt knowledge of like what's going on inside of you. Attachment to the conceptualized self, a kind of a mouthful, but it basically means believing that story you have about yourself, like that you're no good at relationships, or maybe what we might call a positive story, like, I'm a good clinician, right? Which might get in the way of noticing when you're not being so great a clinician. And also addressing disconnection from values, so losing sight of what matters, as we all do every day, and then unworkable action, the sort of doing the same thing no matter what, where we get into those ruts of behavior. And those two all connect with one another, right? So if you're rigidly focusing on the past or future, then you're letting your mind be in charge because there's no past here and there is no future here. There's just now. We address these inflexibility processes with these flexibility processes. And it's not necessary that, if you're on the top left point on the Hexaflex, you have to be addressing the top left point on the Inflexa Hex. But often we think in those terms, but ultimately it's just bringing this stuff to bear in places where people are wrapped up in that other stuff. But here's a really important point. And it's one of the things that got me really excited when I first got into ACT, which is, Steve Hayes said in the first training I ever went to, if it is ACT consistent, then it's ACT. And so there is no specific technique that you have to use to do ACT. There's no metaphor that you have to use ACT. And that's why it's very different from other kinds of evidence-based models that might have a protocol or a curriculum for them. What matters are the processes of change. So you could imagine that helping someone make space for pain could be facilitated in like an infinite number of ways. There's no exercise that's like the essential exercise. So what we're trying to do is get after the function of the process, which is like how it operates, and help the client live it out in your office and then out in the world, not any specific technique. And I'll come back to that point over and over and over again.